a Mini-500 November 500 Zulu X-ray, and I'm going to give you a little walk around and tell you some of the features of this helicopter. It's basically stock, but I did add a few, I think they're upgrades. One of them is right here. You can see this. This is a collective down lock. In the cockpit, knob accessible to the pilot, quarter turn on the knob, and this little clip will spring retract when I push down on the collective. See that? Retract it, and now you have free motion on your collective. And to downlock it again, I just turn this knob to the detent, and then when I push the collective back down, the pin has spring loaded back out, and it downlocks the collective. The other thing we have is a fuel flow meter with an associated gauge on the dash, and I put that in instead of manifold pressure to help the pilot determine his power settings. This is a altitude compensator for the carburetors with a needle valve, again accessible to the pilot right here. You can turn the mixture, you can lean out the mixture at altitude to maintain optimum power by adjusting for peak EGT, exhaust gas temperature. Another feature we have here is this is a throttle governor cable with a spring override. So you see that working there? So I can override the governor at any throttle condition. Go to the other side of the ship. Here's the servo for the throttle governor, and all it is a cruise control unit, aftermarket cruise control unit. As you can see, I don't have the main fuel tank in this side. It's removed for my purposes, so I could have access to this side of the engine compartment for linkage, control linkage adjustments. You can see I cleaned it up real well. There's not a lot of extra cables. They're all tied down and stowed. And again, I'm using the auxiliary oil tank for the fuel tank for these operations. And it's a simple job of just replumbing some of the tubing to incorporate the main tank. The turtle deck comes off with these screws removed. You can see the whole engine compartment. Let me remove this turtle deck. I'll slide it back, and it sits back there. And then what we can see is the whole engine compartment. This is the configuration I had it in for several months when I was working on rebuilding the helicopter. Again, you can see how clean it is. Not a lot of extra wires or confusion. Everything's run really neat. Now, the stock tensioner for the main drive belt used a spring, but I took some rubber Lord mount washers, and I incorporated here instead of the spring, because I think it gives you more stable compression. Here we are on the other side of the helicopter, and I wanted to show you real quick that the mast support unit has been installed. And this tube is the vent for the fuel. The stock 500 has a fuel sight tube inside the cockpit. You can see it, the pilot can see it. I incorporated the fuel shutoff valve here at the bottom. The stock one has it here on the dash, but I thought that was too hard to reach. When you're strapped in with the seat belts, it's hard to reach the this particular portion of the instrument panel. And I also incorporated all these aircraft circuit breakers. The stock model has the circuit breakers behind this panel back in the back here, and it's hard to access, impossible to access in flight. Another thing I did is I incorporated a hinge on the front panel. So by removing these 4 screws, this whole panel swings out on this hinge. Makes it very easy to work on. The original Throttle, the original aircraft, had the ignition switch right here with a key, and I was thinking that's pretty hard to try to do a restart in flight by having to take your hand off the collective. So what I did was I incorporated switches on the throttle. This is a new cluster, my add. This switch here becomes the ignition switch. There's also a 3-position switch and a 2-position slider that you can wire up any way you want for other electronics. Right now I have this switch releasing the cargo hook. This aircraft has dual ignition, so what I did, instead of the ignition key with a 3-position and the start detent on the ignition key, I incorporated 2 kill switches here. So you can still do your mag check by turning off one or turning off the other. Okay, we're back at the engine compartment again, and I wanted to show you another feature that I added in the back here. I don't know if you can see it. I'll put it up here. This block of plastic is not original. In fact, on the original Mini-500s, this is open space, and what ends up happening, this Z-bend of metal over time and hard landings crunches down until your tail is not perpendicular to your mast, and it puts extra strain on your flex coupling right here. So that's something that I added. I think it's a great feature. Going back to the back, another feature I added, the original mechanism to change the pitch on the tail rotor blades was some ball bearings that rode on this, in this channel right here. Well, I replaced those ball bearings with sintered bronze blocks. So those slide along those blocks instead of rolling on the bearings, and that distributes the load a lot more evenly. Now for transport, I'm going to take the blades off at the hub. You can see I got the blades marked A and B along with their corresponding hub pieces. Another thing I'm going to do for transport is I'm going to take this whole tail section off. This piece is going to come off. The hook is going to come out. The T-tail comes off. And this unit comes off assembled, and I'm going to put it in a container for shipping intact. So it's very easy to put it back together. 4 screws. Take the transmission off of the tail. These 4 screws take the vertical section off of the tail. And these 4 screws, actually there's 2 screws on top. See those? Those are removed, and then the T-tail comes off. And let's go through the startup sequence again. Right now the battery switch is on. We have lights on the dash. It's a low RPM light and a generator light. The horn breaker is pulled so we don't have the noise from the horn, and the hook breaker is pulled so we're not using the hook at this time. My fuel selector. Fuel valve is on, down is on. And I have my cyclic lock engaged. And my cyclic friction set. This is my mixture control. It's just a needle valve directing a vacuum source off of the engine into the float bowl chamber to vary the pressure differential between the throat of the carburetor and the float bowl. So in theory that leans the mixture when you open the vacuum valve. Down here we have the ignition switches. Guards up, switches on. So our ignition system is active. Make sure the air clear around the aircraft. I'm going to roll the throttle into the detent and engage on the starter button. Release the starter button and you can hear the aircraft has started. You can see we have good fuel flow. And the battery is charging. I'm going to roll up the throttle a little bit. Let's get some fuel flowing. Clutch is fully engaged now. You see a little indication on the RPM meter. The rotor RPM does not engage until engine RPM is near 90%. cool down on this. There's a couple of minutes. I just usually let it cool down until the blades stop turning. Blades have stopped. So to turn off the engine, you just turn off the ignition switches. Captures that structure piece right there. And by rotating the whole thing around, it slides back in there. There, I did it with one hand. So it's very easy to put in. What happens on the back side, you can see right here, this is where one 8L clamp goes around this pipe and screws into there. And on the other side, compartment here, there's another. Grab this better. Finger up here. There's another nut that's embedded in the plastic tank, and you put an 8L clamp there and wrap it around this structure member. So it goes in very easy. Those two screws and the 8L clamps hold everything in place. And on this particular ship, it would be very easy to replumb this thing so that it's on the main tank. There's the bottom drain and another bottom drain. This would be the main on the bottom. You'd use that for the fuel valve for checking fuel contamination. This is the one that feeds into the engine. Fuel lines the way I've got them configured now. One goes from the tank to the shutoff valve, and then back to the fuel pump. And the other one here, this one just is a T off of the main fuel line here, and it just goes up to the other side. In the cockpit, you see the sight glass. And then it goes up through that hole out, and then that's just the vent line sitting right up there. I have the turtle deck off. I'll show you a few more things. We have the liquid cooling reservoir, this radiator fluid, and we also have the gearbox oil reservoir right in here. Here's the main, I'm sorry, that's the engine gearbox oil. This is the rotor head gearbox, and the fill cap is right here. You can see the batteries mounted, secure, and all the features of the control system are easily accessible. That's the radiator fan in there, driven by a pulley, by a belt with idler pulleys. driven off the engine. This is the clutch, centrifugal clutch right here. How to do the start sequence on this aircraft. I'm using this tank for the fuel. The oil is mixed in with the gas. So this is the oil port for the carburetor, and it's plugged for the engine oil injection. That system's isolated. Okay, so we do the fuel valve is on. Battery switch is on. We have good lights on the panel. You can see we got good voltage here. Ignition switches are both in the up position for hot. Throttle into the detent for idle. And then we push the ignition button to start. Now I'm going to disengage the clutch, the chokes. Light is my low RPM warning. You see the fuel flow is just under 1. So at this point I would do a one last look in the engine compartment and then put the side panel back on. Aircraft. The stock Mini-500 does not have these footsteps, and I added these to make it easier to get in through and out of the aircraft. So I'm going to put my foot here, slide into the cockpit. Okay, so here you can see the instrument panel, aircraft circuit breakers, foot pedals, hobs. There it is, 68.4. Let's go through the startup sequence. You see on the collective, I incorporated a switch cluster. This is the start switch right here. Makes it much easier to start or attempt to restart. You don't have to take your hand off the collective. This is a 3-position switch, and it's available for the new owner to put in whatever they want to put in there. This is a 2-position slide switch, and the way this is set up now, one switch position disables this switch. Down enables this switch. So there's another aspect to starting this that you need to be aware of, is this other switch position. That's the mixture control. It's a vacuum. This is just a needle valve, and it directs a vacuum source into the float bowl air chamber, reducing. When you add vacuum to the float bowl, it reduces the pressure differential into the carburetor, and you have less fuel flowing up into the carburetor. So the theory is that it helps lean the mixture. This is my collective down lock, and right now it is in the lock position. And this is my collective friction. Right now it's in the loose position. This is the cyclic friction, and it's tight. And these are my fuses Right now the governor fuse is out and the hook fuse is out. The horn fuse is out, but we will still have the low RPM light. Low RPM light will be illuminated here. All the other circuit breakers are in that we're using. And this is my fuel shutoff valve. We turn it on. Battery switch on. You see the panel lights with low RPM and the generator light. And we'll roll this thing back out into the detent and make sure the area is clear. And then we can start by pushing the button.